Welcome to Entwined Podcast. We're just a few shows away from our 1-year anniversary, and we wanted to take a moment to say thank you for listening to our stories. So thank you. McKay and I absolutely love it when you reach out to us on social media because it gives us a chance to interact with you about the show. You say you like the show, we say thank you, and somewhere after a little bit of internet mambo, we end up tweeting about the possibility of a third installment of a Bill and Ted film. We're never really sure how it happens, but please keep it coming. For those of you new listeners out there, if you want to support the show, there are a few ways you can make that happen. The first is super simple, is to head on over to patreon.com/entwined and get signed up. The second way is to log on to iTunes and drop us a review. Remember, we're not begging for good reviews here, just help us capture a few honest ones. If you haven't yet rated the show, go ahead, jump on and do so. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you all so much, and stay twined. Entwined is a podcast about how so much of the world around us is wound or twisted together. This podcast strives to lay bare unexposed or indiscernible connections using historical and anecdotal sources. I am Elliot Gladstone, and alongside P.S. McKay, this is Entwined. Remove your 21st century dollar store filters just for a moment and consider the post-biblical methods of sending messages of hopelessness and distress. Sometimes the significance of antiquated communication is overlooked as ineffective and rarely celebrated for its romantic or practical contributions to the social narrative. Amazing prose in heartfelt calligraphy across pulped wood, an artist mapping out their emotions with all the permanency of a T.S. Eliot poem. Hopelessly discussing the relevancy of human voices and their impact on the chambers of the sea. The impossibility of the moment, forever bottled up and transferred through time, across oceans, only to be judged, cataloged, and dismissed. We, us humans, share our most desperate moments without consideration of Melvin Dewey, hoping a kind ocean will deliver our dreams into the future. We have come to recognize pieces of parchment or paper hastily rolled up and placed inside glass bottles for exactly what they are: clear glass, weather and water worn, rolling quickly away from the receding tide to be deposited at the edge of the sun-bleached sand. Brittle paper, uneven and frayed, the color of tanned skin, rolled up and tied with twine. A message in a bottle, a simple yet iconic reminder of a world connected through human interaction, attempting to stretch boundaries and communities beyond what seemed possible. Over time, we have come to associate these messages with hopelessness, the bottle's owner's hurried words on permanent reminder of a desperate condition. Occasionally, the author has found himself in great peril and tosses the bottle into the water in his final moments in an attempt to say goodbye to those he loved. Still, there are other images of men and women confessing their heart's desire with the faith their words will find a way into the hands of the ones they love. With so much to romanticize about, it's amazing to think the earliest recorded message in a bottle was actually dropped into the ocean, not in an effort to say goodbye, or even I love you, but as a way to test a scientific hypothesis about ocean currents. A Greek philosopher was convinced that the Atlantic Ocean flowed directly into the Mediterranean Sea and used message-filled bottles to support his hypothesis. Countless others have used bottles in this way, and when it comes to the pursuit of scientific knowledge, these bottles are more appropriately known as drift bottles. In fact, in 1768, Benjamin Franklin reportedly used drift bottles in an attempt to chart the Gulf Stream while he was Deputy Postmaster General for the American colonies. Franklin was working on a project to identify a potential cause of delayed mail packets sailing from Europe to the Americas. The mail just seemed to take a whole lot longer to get across the ocean than it did for some of the merchant ships. To figure it all out, Franklin elected to use an even slower form of sending letters to test his theory, the drift bottle. There's a little bit of humor in there if you think about it. Nowadays, the only message-filled bottles out there are custom gifts, the unlikely bounties of the internet, holding unconfirmed Abraham Lincoln quotes within their pristine glass shells. Yet somewhere between today and the antique science experiments of yesterday, folks were still hurling bottles into the ocean with the hopes their messages would be received. And it doesn't take a genius to put together that most of these bottles were somehow finding their way into the water after being tossed from the decks of various ocean vessels. In February of 1893, a ship carrying the name Noronic left Liverpool bound for New York with around 75 passengers and just over 2 tons of cargo. Noronic is an odd name for sure, but at the time, almost all of the ships owned or operated by the White Star Line had names that ended with IC, so the name fit the owner. The Noronic headed south from Liverpool past Wales, bending around the southern tip of Ireland nearest the city of Cork, and steamed off carrying cattle and coal to America. After passing Cork and plowing through the waters of the Celtic Sea, the Noronic steamed into the cold black void, otherwise known as the North Atlantic, never to be seen again. The Noronic started its journey at a time when vessels were not fitted with radios to send out distress signals. Not being able to contact other ships in the area or send a coded signal to land would make it next to impossible to call for help. There were no extensive air searches, and no other ships bending their paths to try to locate the lost vessel. It just disappeared. Almost a month passed where the crew's families and friends wondered if they would ever see their loved ones again. Almost a month, because on March 3rd, 1893, after just over 3 weeks, a bottle would be found washed up on a beach in Brooklyn. The very section of Brooklyn which is now known as Bay Ridge, New York. The bottle was sealed with a cork, as they often are, and inside was a page torn from a book with the following handwritten message. February 19, 1893. Noronic sinking. All hands praying. God have mercy on us. Over the next 7 months, 2 more bottles would wash up in Virginia and Ireland until the final bottle would be discovered in the Mersey River just outside of Liverpool. The messages reference icebergs and snowstorms, but most important that all souls were lost at sea. The ship was expected to have sunken quickly, which would have left the passengers with little time to toss their cries for help into the Atlantic. Many suspect a few of the passengers made it onto lifeboats, floating around as seas became rough, as they often do in February, and as they floated, baking in the sun and freezing in the dark, they must have finally felt the impact of how alone they truly were. Nothing aboard the Noronic was ever recovered except for a capsized lifeboat which was discovered due south of where the Noronic would have been traveling. Being alone at sea when surrounded by people is a feeling many in the oceanic transport industry wanted to avoid, and the White Star Line, remember, they owned and operated the Noronic, were no different. The White Star Line wanted its passengers to feel at home and forget they were thousands of miles from civilization. This meant fancy dinners, clean and smart linens, opulent decor, and live music. Sure, nowadays you can throw on a B.B. King album anytime you want, but at the turn of the 20th century you needed a live band if you wanted to fill the room with sound. This provided an opening for a young man named Wallace Hartley to build his career. Wallace Hartley was born in northwest England. His parents, both textile operatives, lived a modest life until moving the family to Doonesbury, which is about a day's walk from Liverpool. As textile operatives, Mr. and Mrs. Hartley were responsible for taking organic materials and turning them into items which get used every day, like clothing, carpets, and linen. Wallace had no interest in following in the footsteps of his parents, and after a failed attempt as a banker, he found his life preserver somewhere buried within his love of music. Wallace Hartley played in a local municipal orchestra, in opera companies, and even did a tour as a band leader for a prominent cafe, which is where he met his future wife. Wallace would eventually land a gig working for the Cunard Passenger Line, a company which would later merge with the White Star Line, where he ended up sailing on the Lusitania and then joining her sister ship, the Mauretania, as bandmaster. Cunard and White Star were both major players in the industry. In fact, there were quite a few companies out there being bought, sold, and merging together around the time Wallace was in the band on the Lusitania. There was a coordinated attempt to align several of the larger shipping companies, putting them together in a trust called the International Mercantile Marine Company, or IMM, which was operated under the leadership of John Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan for short. J.P. Morgan successfully organized several shipping companies under one house, the International Mercantile Marine Company, where each of the smaller companies would operate as a subsidiary of the larger parent company. For those of you who have listened to episode 25 Slingshot, you might recognize this tactic to create a monopoly, as it was basically what Rockefeller tried to do with the Standard Oil Trust. J.P. Morgan was smart, like really smart. Many of you today only know the name as part of J.P. Morgan Chase & Company, a global financial services firm with assets over $2.5 trillion. But the truth is that J.P. Morgan and his business endeavors date back to the end of the 19th century. In addition to his new shipping monopoly, he had his hands in Edison General Electric, United States Steel Corporation, International Harvester, and AT&T. Morgan wanted to further his stake in the shipping industry by locking down transport contracts with railroads, which would allow for a complete domination at the ports. Morgan seemed to find himself on the right side of many investments, including how he essentially bankrolled some of Thomas Edison's earlier projects, specifically with his work on the incandescent light bulb. Edison, as you may remember from a prior episode, was instrumental in the creation of several game-changing technologies, one of those being telegraphy. I will not recount in detail all that Edison did, but after finding success, he agreed to join forces with a man named Guglielmo Marconi on a project to create and improve wireless telegraphy technology. So the Darth Vader version of Edison lives in the shadows and steals patents by the handful as children wander around in tears wondering who stole their candy. And is this fair? Is this a fair representation of Edison? Maybe, but the bottom line is he officially joined with Marconi's wireless telegraphy company as a consultant. The concept of wireless telegraphy was exciting and exactly what was needed as these shipping industries forged their way into the next century. Edison's pal Marconi was working hard to establish a wireless communication between France and England and eventually all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. This was a huge deal. Marconi basically created the technology which made the message in a bottle obsolete. The goal was to be able to communicate using his equipment from ship to shore, from ship to ship, or from shore to shore, and sure enough, it worked. Had the Neuronic sailed at a time when it could have had one of the Marconi radios aboard, the crew could have notified some other ship for help, thus solving a century-old mystery. But no matter how hard we try, or how fun it is, we cannot rewrite history. Marconi was a pretty interesting guy. Born in Italy, his father was wealthy and his mother was Irish and part of the Jameson family of distillers. He was fond of tinkering, and it was in this passion that led to many of his inventions, which included his work on wireless telegraphy. Marconi worked hard, and with Edison on board, he won the Nobel Prize in 1909 for physics. Marconi was not able to bring home the hardware without drawing a few questions from the scientific community, and you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that Nikola Tesla contested Marconi's wireless patents with the claim that Tesla was the sole inventor of this new technology. Edison and Tesla have some history, what with the war of currents and all, and Marconi seemed to be along for the ride. Marconi would prove the winner of the moment, but amazingly enough, if you hit the fast forward button jumping ahead 50 years, you would see that the U.S. Supreme Court threw out 4 Marconi radio patents, citing that Tesla had proven his inventions came first. That all being said, it is important to remember that at the time, these were called Marconi radios, and they were often operated by Marconi men. With so many transatlantic ships getting lost or ending up in a watery grave, it was important to move the technology along. Wireless telegraphy was cutting edge, and after the turn of the 20th century, and although it wasn't a perfect system, these Marconi radios started to find their way into larger and larger ocean liners. Marconi was a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and there was no better ship to get such a new and amazing radio system for its maiden voyage than the Titanic. The Titanic, officially the RMS Titanic, was a British passenger liner built in Ireland and designed for luxury travel across vast oceans. Somewhere north of 2,200 passengers and crew aboard this behemoth left port on a cold day in April of 1912. As you undoubtedly already know, the ship was headed to New York, but just after a few days sank, failing to reach its destination. The story of the Titanic is well known in both truth and fiction, allowing folks to choose their own adventure when it comes to stories of those who met tragedy on that fateful day. Some of the stories are well known, like those of the unsinkable Molly Brown, or even more famously the love affair between the fictional Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Bukater. Yes, fictional, because despite what many teenage girls across America believed, Rose and Jack never existed. Other popular stories are slightly less well known, but true, like those courageous tales of Benjamin Guggenheim, or that of Thomas Andrews, whose body was never recovered. But the story of how the Marconi radio ended up saving those who were fortunate enough to end up in a lifeboat isn't one that gets told often. Sure, that Marconi radio was utilized often in the days leading up to the ship's impact with the iceberg to try to warn the crew of the dangers ahead, and the Titanic's crew would overlook those warnings. For reasons which are heavily debated, the crew would eventually be in the unfortunate position to transmit the very first distress call just after midnight on April 15, 1912, when the following message was transmitted. CQD Titanic, which was then followed by map coordinates. So what the heck is CQD? Well, CQD is an easily transmitted acronym using any sort of wired or wireless telegraphy machine. Captains would send the CQD distress signal along with a location to ships in the area with the hopes they could receive assistance. CQD must stand for something, right? Well, the internet is a little divided on this. There are several sites which claim that CQD stands for Come, Quick, Danger, which to me honestly sounds perfect. Almost perfect enough to just move on, but that's not really how we roll here at Entwined. There are other sites which say that there was not a convention for the Marconi machines to function in this way, and CQD means all stations distress. Either way, the Titanic was sending out a distress call, and anyone on the other side would quickly get the gist of what was trying to be communicated. In the next radio message, the Titanic, extremely desperate to call for help, would be the first ship to utilize a new distress signal for the first time. Moments after the first message, the Titanic sent the following radio message: CQD, CQD, SOS, Titanic position, followed by map coordinates. Require immediate assistance. Come at once. We struck an iceberg. Sinking. Catch that? The Marconi man operating the radio snuck an SOS into the ship's call for help. These were new times. Technology had changed, and tossing a message in a bottle into the water from the deck of a ship was just so 19th century. Using the term SOS was an even bigger deal because Marconi was not too keen on giving up his proprietary CQD call in lieu of what would end up being its replacement for, well, pretty much ever. So Okay, it's true that this too is debated, and many feel the first time SOS was used predates the sinking of the Titanic by 3 years, but heck, this was the Titanic, and these were Marconi men operating the radio. So let's just live for a little bit in a world where SOS could get used for the first time on the sinking of one of the most famous ships in history. As the ship sank, the Marconi machine ended up saving the 700 passengers who found a way into a lifeboat, or in the case of Rose DeWitt Bukater, remember, fictional character, onto a floating object just outside the radius of what would have been dragged below the waterline when the ship finally sank. Now, I am not an expert of the popular film, but I think Rose was floating on a door, which really has its own sort of irony, I guess. The boat didn't sink immediately, and the crew continually sent messages of distress until the Goliath finally went under the surface of the ocean. There must have been so much chaos, it is amazing that anyone could find their way off the ship. Interestingly enough, as the giant ship sank into the cold black water of the Atlantic, the band was called upon one last time to try to keep the passengers calm during the evacuation. Yes, the rich and famous were all moving around the deck to find their respective lifeboats as the band played "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Seriously, the band played while the people filled the last few lifeboats of the massive ship, and it eventually sank, taking her final rest at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And the band leader responsible for this moment would be remembered for an eternity, and even get referenced in the Oscar-winning film of 1998, was none other than Wallace Hartley. Wallace, dedicated to his craft, would finally be found floating with his famous violin strapped to his chest, a violin which found its way back to land and would eventually fetch over $1 million at auction. Wallace started his career in entertainment aboard the Lusitania and only made the switch to the Titanic just a few days before she set sail for America because he just wanted to be part of history. History has a way of evening things out. Some of you may be aware that there were several famous passengers originally ticketed on the Titanic that for one reason or another ended up sailing on a different ship. Sure, there was Alfred Vanderbilt and Milton Hershey, but those guys aren't really part of our story. More remarkably was Marconi. He was scheduled to sail on the Titanic as part of his reward for winning the Nobel Prize, but he declined the honor. Marconi was awarded the Nobel Prize and thus offered free travel for inventing the very technology which enabled the survivors of the Titanic to be rescued while floating around in the frigid Atlantic water. Another passenger who decided to forego their travel plans and abandon a suite and private promenade deck aboard the Titanic was none other than J.P. Morgan. Morgan was the owner of the shipping monster, the IMM, which had in its portfolio the White Star Line, which claimed ownership of the Titanic. Remember before I mentioned, or maybe subtly hinted, if you prefer, that most of the ships owned by the White Star Line ended with IC? Well, the Titanic obviously was no different in this respect. Morgan expected to be on the Titanic for that maiden voyage, but instead, he elected to stay in Europe just a little bit longer to enjoy some prominent sulfur baths. As I said, history has a way of evening things out. In 1915, just over 3 years after the sinking of the Titanic, Marconi was aboard the Lusitania when it was struck by the torpedo of a German U-boat and eventually sank. Alfred Vanderbilt, who also elected to skip the Titanic voyage, would end up being on that same ship as well. Milton Hershey, he wasn't on the Lusitania, but he was on one called the America, which was one of the first ships to send a message to the Titanic on the Marconi radio, warning her of the dangers ahead. In fact, around 30 White Star Line ships found their way to the bottom of the ocean while steaming under the ownership of the powerful company, almost all of them having names that ended with IC. Technology has a way of demanding a renewed awareness of facts despite the quality of improvements made over time. Things change, as they always do, and people work to develop new and better ways to get things done. It is in this superstore of information where we highlight lower tech transmissions into the comfortable newness we have come to expect. Marconi didn't directly replace the message in a bottle, and despite the improvements to the lower, yet arguably more romantic technology, humans will always live their lives where the old meets the new. In March of 1913, a bottle washed up on a beach of the city of Cork to be found by a local postman walking his dog. The bottle was authenticated as being owned by a man named Jeremiah Burke, who had written on a small piece of paper and placed it into a small bottle given to him by his mother to store holy water for his journey. On the paper was inscribed the following message: April 13, 1912, from Titanic. Goodbye all, Burke of Glanmire. Despite all the improvements to technology over time, despite how unsinkable the Titanic was expected to be, despite having all of the comforts of home, the people aboard the Titanic were just as hopeless as those aboard the Noronic or any of the other sunken White Star ships. That hopelessness giving way to despair, and eventually giving way to the realization that somehow it is your responsibility to tell the world that you need to be remembered.
Thank you for listening. This has been Entwined. Entwined is a podcast that releases every other week and is written, recorded, edited, and produced by Elliot Gladstone and P.S. McKay. This episode was written by Elliot Gladstone. Please tune in next time to see what P.S. McKay has in store for us. For more information about the show or the authors, please check out entwinedpodcast.com or visit our Twitter page at entwinedpodcast.